Hello, this is the VAPALS ELCAP OSEHRA Working Group meeting for February 20th, 2019. And we have Rick Marshall to tell us about kind of how we organize things. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is picking up on the second half of last week's call. Last week's call had a wonderful user-facing component, and then we followed that with some technical discussion, introducing a topic that we're going to dig more into today. And I think next week is where we will get to the punchline of what I'm trying to get to, which is how we organize and name repositories and directories. This is important because the VAPALS ELCAP environment that we're setting up is managed through repositories. And so those repos have to have consistent names and consistent organization, or else we'll end up having to do everything manually. Likewise, the directory structure for where do you put VAPALS ELCAP on a server, and within its main directory, where are things laid out? Again, plays into that whole, if it's ad hoc and everybody does whatever they want, then you have a tremendous amount of kind of manual intervention and human thought that's required to figure out everything you might want to do. And we want to get to where these systems are easy to manage. To be easy to manage, we need software tools, and the software tools can't be, they can't be automated at all if nothing is in any kind of standard or consistent location. So what we're going to talk about today is the different classes of repositories and what they're going to try to accomplish, and what that means as far as the kinds of things we need to be able to compare or contrast. What are the distinctions we need to be able to draw? What things do we need to know when they're the same? And what things do we need to know when they're different? And if we can figure that out and come up with our schemas for how we name things to make it clear when we're talking about the same thing and when we're talking about different things, and which kind of things we have to talk about, from that, the system follows for how we name things and how things are laid out. So I'm going to start with a modified version of what we saw last week. We're talking about the idea that last week we talked about what are called distribution repositories or repos. And a distribution repository's primary purpose is to get software to your system from developers. And this is complicated by the fact that the software is not developed in a cathedral. It's not developed by one centralized authority, which is a good thing, because if it were, it wouldn't be able to keep up with the pace of innovation in the world. We talked last week about the fact that medical software systems have three big drivers that push change aggressively. Medicine is constantly changing because medical science is constantly having breakthroughs. Computer science is constantly changing, and the law and policies about what you're allowed to do with medical data and medicine in general are constantly changing. And the intersection of those three things hits medical software hard. So if you come up with a system for software development that is very, very, very safe, very focused on testing, but it can't keep pace with development, then we can promise you that you're going to hurt people. Because medicine is constantly figuring out, some things that we thought were good ideas turn out to be bad ideas, and some practices which were good ideas at the time need to be replaced by spectacularly better medical ideas. For example, that's what the whole VAPALS ELCAP initiative is about. We haven't come up with the medical experts in ILCAP and ILCART through decades of study have come up with a dramatically better way to screen and test for and treat lung cancer that can significantly drive the survival rate, the 5-year survival rate, from sort of catastrophic levels that have made lung cancer one of the top killers to just spectacularly better than where they were. So this is a change in the medicine that's driving a change in the software, and the software development shop has to be able to keep up with that. So what you're looking at here in distribution repos is you're coming up with a balance between how centralized and tested and controlled and safe is the software development versus how innovative and fast and nimble is the software development. You have to solve both of those problems. You can't just come up with a compromise. You have to actually keep up with medicine and computer science and the law, and at the same time, you can't kill anybody. So the system is organized orthogonally so that rather than coming up with a compromise, we support complete high-speed innovation on the one hand for people who are working in those arenas, and on the other, as things get closer and closer to being installed in production, we also support safer and safer, more and more stable, more and more standardized approaches. This goes hand in hand with the question of automation versus manual. The more innovative you are, the more you just came up with your own things that nobody else knows about, the more there won't be any software written that knows what it is you're doing, and it won't be able to assist you in any ways in what you're trying to accomplish, which means it's going to require a lot of manual intervention. The more standardized you are, the more consistent you are, the more tools can be written because they know where things are going to be placed and what they're going to be called, which therefore gives you a boost in productivity. So it's not just the case that the innovative people are more productive. They're more productive out of the gate, but they impose all kinds of burdens that reduce productivity when it comes time to try to create automated tools to speed things up, because they can't, because they're not following any patterns. And likewise, the slowness of the classic slowness of the cathedral where things are safe produces productivity boosts on the end when you're trying to make tools that automate the use of those products, because everything is in some consistent location and you can actually write those tools. So we have this basic schema of gold, silver, copper that we introduced last week. I'm not going to belabor it this week, but part of the reason that we do it is that any given Vista production server or any Vista server needs to be able to be a receiver of all three kinds of software. And it needs to receive them in consistent locations so that automation tools can be written. But those locations need to be able to make the distinction between how standardized are the contents of this repo. Is this something that, I can pull it down, but then after that, some sysadmin is going to have to look at it manually and figure out what to do? Or is this in some very consistent standardized way so that maybe I could have automation tools that, once it's pulled down onto the system, could load it into the Vista environment and do all the initial checks and prepare it for when it's time to install. Ideally, we want to get to a world where you could set up configuration files that have tables with schedules and that classify patches based on how disruptive they are, so that the system could automatically do updates that are not invasive and could save the more invasive ones, but at least prep them and notify the sysadmins when they're ready to install. And we want to move in that direction. One of the classic things about Vista environments is the medical software is so complex, and that means the process of change is complex, which means it's a very human-intensive process to keep Vista servers up to date. For our purposes, for the VAPALS ELCAP project, we can't afford that. We need these VAPALS ELCAP servers to be lightweight and easy for the VA sites to install and to manage, which means we're going to be investing heavily in automation tools, which is why we're investing heavily in standardization. All right, so one last thing I'll say about distribution repos before I move on to the class that I didn't talk about last week. And the thing I'm going to say is, our goal is to get to where eventually we have a forum server like the VA has classically used, but upgraded to be able to handle version control, to be able to use version control tools like Git, which is our current focus and has been for some years, and where it's Git smart. Right now, a forum uses either email. Inside the VA, forum uses either email to distribute patches and updates to the sites, or it uses FTP / SCP, some secure methods of sort of manually. It dumps things into a standard directory and then tells people come and get it, and then somebody manually has to go and get it. And neither of these things is optimal. Neither of these things is using the full power of what the open source community outside of the VA and outside the Vista world have come up with. So what we want to move towards is a world in which forum substitutes, instead of doing email or manual file copying, we want it to be using repositories, Git repos, to be its transmission system, so that whenever it's got an update and a new release patch has been verified and tested and it's ready for release and it goes out, the way that it goes out is that it gets pushed into a repo, into a standard location, and then everybody who's a subscriber to that repo either gets some kind of a notification to come and get it, or they have some kind of polling job running on their production server that periodically reaches to the repo and says, give me a refresh, see what's in there, and if there's something new, notify my sysadmin. So we're talking about using the repos as a distribution methodology, not just version control and the other things that repos are famous for. But that's not the only kind of repo that we need. We also need production repos. And the reason that we need production repos is that there is an initiative that's been going on in the VA, and it's long overdue, although I think at the moment it's underfunded and there's not enough work going on in it because they're all hoping Cerner will save everything and make them not have to think this through, which I'm not predicting will work very well. And it's also needed outside the VA and by everybody else, and that is we need the ability to compare to the Vista that's running on two different servers and find out what are the similarities and what are the differences. Now, people have always said, well, you can use repos for that, or just use the diff tool. And it's true that repos and diff tools and things like that are going to be helpful, but just waving your arms and saying, there's tools, and so the problem is, it's as though the problem is already fixed. It is like saying, I've just thought of the idea of rockets, and I've built some rockets that I've done some things with, so I think we can go to the moon. In fact, let's just call it done. We already did it because we thought of it. The difference between knowing the tools you're going to use and figuring out how on earth you're going to apply them to make it possible to compare, say, the Phoenix Vista system to the Seattle Vista system and see what's similar and what's different between them. It's actually quite a difficult thing to do, which is why the Vista standardization effort hasn't actually solved this problem yet inside the VA. Part of the reason that this is important is that the way that Vista works is it's not like installing Microsoft Word. You don't get a Xerox copy of what everybody else has. You install what's called sort of a baseline version of your dialect. We're going to talk about dialects in a bit, but think about a Vista dialect as a complete code base of Vista. There's all the applications that you might want to use are in it, but they might not be identical to the code base that some other dialect is running. For example, Indian Health Service has a bunch of software that VA doesn't have. So an Indian Health Service site like IHS Phoenix has a lot of the same, most of the same code that's running at VA Phoenix, but they also have a bunch of other code that's unique to IHS. And VA has some code that's unique to VA. And furthermore, each of those individual sites might have custom tailoring that they've done, innovations that they've come up with locally, so that there's a number of different dimensions of variability between these sites. And sorting them out and figuring out why they vary and what you want to do about it. For example, do you discover that at VA Phoenix, there's some marvelous innovation that was come up with in the 90s that's being used all the time, and everybody forgot about it, and the people at Phoenix forgot that it wasn't national, and so nobody realizes that there's this great innovation there? Or is there something wonderful running at IHS Phoenix that's really about Arizona law and Arizona medical practice that maybe isn't specific to IHS? And it would be nice if VA Phoenix and VA Tucson and all the other VAs that are in Arizona had it as well, because it's not actually IHS specific. But they don't know because they haven't talked and they haven't compared notes. So cracking this problem of how do you actually compare the contents of two production servers is what Vista standardization is about. And that's what the fourth class of repos is for. Platinum repos are not for distribution. The point of them is not to distribute software to install somewhere else. Platinum repos are about sort of auditing what's actually in that environment and putting it somewhere so that you could set up an analysis server that can draw the contents from two different servers and put them side by side so that you can then run analysis tools on them. So, for example, if P here is the VA Phoenix server and Q here is the IHS Phoenix server, then if they were following the standards for pushing their contents out into a production repo, a platinum repo, then some interagency sharing initiative could stand up a Phoenix analysis server, and under side by side directories, it could have the contents of both of those systems, which then makes it possible to start doing the comparisons. So the reason I bring this up is what we need to be able to put side by side and distinguish from each other to tell that they're different, and what we need to be able to put side by side and compare to each other and see that they're the same. That answers the questions about how we have to name our repos, name our directories, name our environments, name our systems, name all these other things, so that as we do this big dance of taking copies of systems and moving them from place to place, we don't get confused about which one is which. I'll give you an example, a couple of examples of some problems that this is meant to solve. So last week I talked about how Christopher Edwards and Sam had both had repos for the MWeb server. And if you download their repos from GitHub, if you clone them onto your local computer, they both call themselves MWeb server. So which one is which? Which one is Sam's and which one is Christopher's? And is one of them the official one and the other one is sort of, mirroring it, and so is more of a curiosity unless you're the person involved? Or are they two side-by-side dialect versions that are trying to keep in sync with each other while they both innovate on their own paths? What is their relationship to each other? Well, the names don't tell us. There's no standardization being followed. And the reason there's no standardization is because they're the trailblazers. They were the ones running out there, pushing Vista into the world of GitHub and doing development on massive numbers of fronts, on massive numbers of different things. And somebody had to go first. But the purpose of standardization is to follow along behind the innovators, look at what they've done, learn from the things that they've done right, learn from the problems that they didn't solve, and come up with solutions that then could be applied. So one of the things we want to do is we want to name these repos so that we can tell them apart based on whose repo is this and where is it from and what is its status. We wouldn't want to confuse a copper repo, which was somebody's free-for-all development environment, with a gold repo that was meant to be installed in production, because the gold stuff's gone through testing and verification and would be theoretically safe for production. Whereas the free-for-all, somebody might be in the middle of ripping apart the code and it doesn't actually run right now, but it's going to be great someday. And in the meantime, nobody should be running this code. It's a developer's playpen. And if you mix those up and you drop broken, pulled apart code into your production environment, it could have medical consequences. This is why we have to make these distinctions. So that's one of the big things. And another big thing is if we compare IHS Phoenix to VA Phoenix, and if we were following a naming standard, which we just called the environment Phoenix, now when we drop them side by side on the Vista analysis server, we can't tell them apart. So we have to know which dialect they belong to. We need a system for naming dialects that makes it clear that, this is the IHS Phoenix environment, and this is the VA Phoenix environment. Specifically, this is Vista, VA Vista, versus this is IHS RPMS, RPMS being the name of the Indian Health Service dialect. So I'm going to hop out for a sec just as a reminder. I showed this last week, but I just want to show it again briefly, that there are a lot of different dialects of Vista. And the goal is to have as few as possible. Ideally, we would like to reunify a bunch of these dialects. We want to consolidate on the smallest number of dialects possible. Every dialect requires a Vista development house to do massive amounts of work, keeping all of the different patch streams going, updating lab, updating pharmacy, updating everything else. There's a lot of reinvention of the wheel that's involved. You split dialects. The good time to split dialects and make separate dialects is when you really need to be running something different in a big way. Not just you changed a routine or an option, but whole applications are different, large numbers of them. In that case, you have to split and you have to be willing to pay the price. But because it is a big price, it also means you don't want to split. You want to do Vista standardization. You ideally want to bring these together into a coherent dialect so that as much as possible, we're running the same dialect, so that if IHS is spending time and resources working on their lab application, it doesn't have to be exactly the same work that's going on in VA on their slightly different and slightly incompatible version of lab. You'd like them to be on the same lab and have them each kind of just plugging in additional modules where they can so that they don't actually create a conflict. So this is one of the big tensions that's going on here. And we need to name these things. When we created this diagram from 2011 to 2014, Carol and I, one of the reasons that we did it is that the community was not talking about dialects coherently. We wanted to have a big conversation at OSEHRA about Vista standardization and reunification and how you could actually start the process and make it happen. But most people didn't even know there was such a thing as a dialect, let alone, I mean, if they could name one or two or three, that was all they could name. They didn't have any idea that there were this many dialects or how they were related to each other. So, but even when we did this in 2014, one of the things that you can see here is that although we've come up with a sort of a name for each one based on what they call themselves, and sort of an identification of the organization, and some kind of a status indication about whether it's active or not, there's no coherent code here. There's not a clear designation that allows you to distinguish one dialect from another. And you can get into trouble with that. For example, there's multiple open vistas. There's a MedSphere open vista, there's an open vista, there's a HUI open vista, and there's an open VX vista. These names are all very similar to each other. And in everyday speech, it would be easy to say this and not actually know which one you were referring to. But if you're actually trying to set up side-by-side environments, you have to know exactly what you're comparing. So we need a level of precision that hasn't existed yet. And that's why we're proceeding with what we're about to do. The specific directory structures I'm showing you here, lib and run and gold, silver, copper, and platinum, we're not going to get into directories in this week. Directory names and repo names, we're going to do next week. This week's work is going to set us up to be able to talk about this. There's basically three passes I have to take you through. I'd introduce the problem, which we did last week, and I think I've recapped this week, kind of the scale of what it is that we're trying to solve. Then we need to talk about how we name dialects and development shops and adopters and sites and systems. In other words, the computers that are actually involved, and who runs them, and who do they belong to, and so forth. Because as you might, we're talking about servers here. These servers all theoretically have to have names to distinguish themselves from each other. I mean, see what we've got here in the production repos. Vistaprod Server P and Vistaprod Server Q need to have names that are distinct enough that if you put their production, their platinum contents over on an analysis server, and the only distinction is P versus Q, it has to be meaningful and make sense so that we know which one is which. So we're going to talk about servers first. Today we're going to drive towards, by the end of the call, we'll have talked about what our system is for naming servers and computers. And as along the way, we're going to name a lot of other things that gets us there. Then next week, we'll be in a position to talk about the Vista environments that you might have on those servers, how you name them, how you name the directories that they're using, how you name the directories where you put the repos, and how you name the repos. And that'll finish off this technical discussion about how we identify all of these different servers. So dialect and developer, right? So we needed to come up with codes for this lineage of Vista diagram. We needed to get coherent about this. So we've come up with little three-letter codes, and this is partially derived from the namespacing schema that's used by the Database Administrators Committee. That's an organization. It's part of OSEHRA. There used to be separate database administrators in VA and IHS and sort of out in the world generally who didn't talk to each other very much. And we worked together as a community. And we put together a DBAC within OSEHRA that meets from time to time and compares notes to make sure that how things are named in VA, how they're named in IHS, how they're named in World Vista, and how they're named by the Vista Expertise Network is coherent. So the OSEHRA community is following a consistent practice. The reason that this is important is that in a Mumps environment, the primary way of distinguishing lab software elements from pharmacy software elements from other kinds is by the prefix that's at the beginning of formally named software elements. So a routine, which is the Mumps equivalent of a program, sort of, has a name. And all the routines live together in one great big directory. And so if we don't name them in such a way that lab stays out of the way of pharmacy, then as they do development, they're going to clobber each other. So there is this vast namespacing schema. It's incredibly complex, and it has evolved over many decades. And it's used to coordinate the activities of thousands of people all over the world who are doing development in such a way to make sure that if they follow the rules of the dance, if they name things the way that they're supposed to, they don't collide with each other. That it allows the development to be decentralized so that it can be innovative without being chaotic. So We based the schema for naming dialects partially on that, but not completely. We had a couple of other things that we wanted to solve. And one of the things that we want to solve is we want the first letter of the dialect code to make clear which software community we're talking about. So all of the Vista development, whether it's done by IHS or if it's being done in Nigeria or or in Finland or Jordan or it's by VA or it's World Vista or whoever it is, the dialects all start with V. V is for Vista. We're giving away an entire letter of the alphabet. This distinction is being done not at the level of VA or the Vista community. This distinction, this naming of dialects, is being done at the level of the Mumps development community. These codes are going to be unique across the entire universe of Mumps systems. And to make that happen, they're registered with the Mumps development committee. So everything that starts with V is a Vista system. Hypothetically, we could imagine that if there are multiple lines of development in the Epic medical software system, which is written in Mumps, maybe they would start with E, right? So these big players will each get a chunk of the namespace that'll be used to name the different dialects that they have. I don't know how Epic is organized internally within their community. I have some ideas, but I don't know for certain. But that's not my problem today. My problem is to make sure the Vista universe is laid out clearly. So now, with these little codes, if we wanted to compare, for example, the RPMS that Indian Health Service runs inside their firewall to what they release through the FOIA, which is probably missing some vendor extensions and it's probably missing some security extensions and so forth. We now have a way to specifically name VBR can be the IHS version of RPMS, and VBF can be the FOIA version of RPMS. And we can use that when we're naming things. Like if we're going to name two repos, we might include the VBR or VBF as part of the name. Or similarly, VA Vista versus FOIA Vista. Or if we want to compare OSEHRA Vista, VOS, to FOIA Vista, VAF, we now have a little code that we can use to distinguish the two repos. Even though they're closely related, they have slightly different contents. And a whole point of doing an analysis between them might be to figure out what's in one and not in the other. And so now we have a way to name that. The schema generally started from the fact that VA was for VA. And as you'll see when we turn the page to the next screen, A was typically used as a namespace for naming VA sites, whereas B was typically used as a namespace for naming Indian Health Service software extensions and IHS sites. So that's why Indian Health Service got VB. And CHCS was the name of the DoD version. They were never as well organized on this front as IHS and VA were because of the nature of DoD and SAIC and their relationship. They sort of paralyzed the software, then complained about the fact that it didn't keep up with medicine because they weren't actually improving it, which was their own fault, but they wanted to blame the software, and so that led them to try to replace it with other things, which is how they end up running 25 different medical technologies today that are all incompatible and make a horrible labyrinth. So I decided VC for CHCS would be sufficient to stand in for the DoD stuff, and I'm not going to try to make further distinctions. Some of these others got names like Hui Open Vista got the HO because Hui Open. Musti and Minfis, which are related systems that started out in Finland and then migrated and took plant in Nigeria, they got the VM. OSEHRA, I gave them the O and the S for open source. MedSphere got the S from Sphere, and they have at least two distinct dialects that we have to distinguish, the one that they're running at their sites, and then what George Timpson calls MedSphere FileMan, which is what he develops, in which the FileMan is not actually identical now either to the VA version or to the MedSphere version, so it needs its own distinction. Vista Expertise Network stuff goes under VV for VEN, is the V. World Vista has always had VW as a namespace. VWE for World Vista EHR, and VX Vista, Document Storage Systems Vista, they get VX. So the reason that we're making these distinctions in this schema is we're going to use these code fragments to build up coherent, precise names that allow us to make distinctions between directories and repositories and systems and sites and so forth. A couple of placeholders that we need. One is if you don't say which dialect your software goes with, we have a code for that. It's VZZ. And the ZZ dates back to the fact that before the hard hats meeting in the early 80s when all sites were given their own unique name, like ARJ for Puget Sound or APG for Phoenix. It used to be that if you did local development, they just said put it under the name ZZ. And the problem with doing that is, if Phoenix makes their own ZZ routine and Puget Sound makes their ZZ routine, and then they try to share with each other, they might be using the same name. And so that was it was collisions like that that led them to clue in that they needed to come up with unique namespaces for every different site so that the local development wouldn't collide when you shared it with each other. So, but that means that the ZZ is still free here to say, if you are, for example, if you made a repo on GitHub and your name were Sam Habiel, and it was kernel GTM extensions. In other words, extensions to the kernel application that would allow it to run better on GTM. But you didn't say which dialect it was meant to run on. Maybe because you were hoping it would run on every dialect, but maybe because you were just focusing on solving the problem today and dialects were just like a whole other level of complexity you didn't need. Then now you've got a way to declare your dialect, which you'd say VZZ, which is, I haven't dealt with dialect issues. I'm not promising it's going to run on your dialect. I hope it will. I've been working on that, but I haven't tested it against any particular list. And so I can't tell you exactly which one it is. Or that would be your way of saying, maybe it runs on multiple dialects. And so you shouldn't be saying, that it's just FOIA Vista or that it's just OSEHRA Vista. VZZ could also be your way of saying, this runs on 8 different dialects of Vista. So VZZ, I don't have to declare a dialect. It covers a lot of ground. MDC related stuff will go under MDC, and the other Mumps implementers will get other M namespaces for their repos, like YadaDB/GTM. They're out there in repos, and they would go under various M names. And if it's not Vista related at all, so if I was pulling down something that had been developed, maybe it was Java code, or maybe it's C# or something, and it's not, and it doesn't plug into Vista, I can give it a dialect code of ZZZ. Right, which is an extension of the ZZ idea. And that just says it's not about Mumps, it's not about Vista. So if I have to have a placeholder, that's what it is. Derived from this, there's this notion of developer or development shop codes. And this is going to be important in a moment. But you can see that it's inherent in the schema. When I first came up with the dialect code schema, it didn't ensure that all the different dialects that came from the same development shop started with the same 2 letters. I overhauled that this year so that we would have a more coherency in this, which we're going to need on the next page. Turning to the next page. So now that we've got that out of the way, we've effectively come up with some very high-level codes that allow us to talk about the entire universe of Vista software and entire dialects of Vista software and development shops who develop lots of different pieces of Vista software. So that's going at the very large end of the scale. So now let's zoom down to the very small end of the scale. We're gonna skip past all the namespacing. That's the vast majority of namespaces that have been assigned to specific software applications, like PS for lab and LR for lab, PS for pharmacy, and so forth. They've each got their own prefix. There's 100 some odd applications, or more if you count all the applications that were started and never released, or that were only run for 5 or 10 years and then retired. Or it's a gigantic spreadsheet. But we're going to skip past that because it's not directly relevant yet to what we want to talk about. And we're going to focus on the other end of the spectrum, which is, okay, software is all well and good, but I also need computers. I have adopters who are setting up sites that have 1 or more systems on them that are running Mumps environments. And I need to be able to name my environments, my systems, my sites, and my adopters in coherent ways, so that if I say that I've got a repo that has the VA Phoenix software and I've got a repo that has the VA Puget Sound software, those repo names can be derived from the system names or the site names, which in turn could be derived from the adopter names. So that's what this schema here is about. And I'm going to slow down a little bit through here to introduce the different elements of this and how they work, and how it all comes together. So first of all, the idea of an adopter is that an adopter is a large-scale organization, or possibly a very small-scale organization, that runs 1 or more Vista production sites. And they might be producing medicine and medical care by running Vista, or they might be producing Vista software that they then release to production sites, or it might be Larry's private laptop where he does a certain amount of development. Larry might have 2 or 3 different computers, or he might have multiple sites. He might have a computer that he leaves at the office. He might have one that's at his home. Who am I to say? But he is an authority unto himself in the same way that the VA is an authority unto itself, in the same way that the Kingdom of Jordan is an authority unto itself. And so each of these authorities is going to have their own codes and namespaces associated with them, so that we can start to sort out what systems belong to whom. So following the pattern that VA established at that early Hard Hats meeting, namespaces that start with A generally stand for VA sites. So VA as a whole we could think of as A star. And that's why VA is the Vista sites that are run by Veterans Affairs. Likewise, as we said before about B, that'll stand for Indian Health Service. C doesn't really stand for DoD. It's not entirely clear what the namespacing schema is for DoD. 15, 20 years ago, I guess 20 years ago, I did a bunch of calls to the DoD people when there were still people around who really understood CHCS in-house. And there was a lot of confusion. There had been schemas that had been set up and never actually rolled out. They were going to support local development at all the sites before the DoD SAIC relationship broke down, and they instead froze everything and prevented things from being changed and blocked local mods. So they have a bunch of different kinds of names. There might be some C namespaces. There are definitely some G and I namespaces, but it never quite fully became a living system. So we'll just sort of wave our arms a little bit here and not worry too much about DoD after this. But these three have in common that they're federal. Started out in the federal government. When it went out to other non-federal adopters, at first, the way that Cameron Schlehuber, who was the database administrator at the time, the way that he would give out namespaces to the sites, like, say, Western State Hospital in Washington State and Eastern State Hospital in Washington State. They wanted to, for these mental health hospitals, wanted to run Vista, and they needed their own namespace for local development. He would just pick one. He'd just look at his big list of namespaces and say, here's a namespace I haven't given anybody. Why don't you take that? He might give them WSH for Western State Hospital. I mean, there was no schema to it at all. Because at the time, we were so delighted that anybody was interested in Vista. We're like, hey, join the party. It's like now it's VA, IHS, DOD, and Bob over there. So Bob can have BOB for Bob. Hooray. And the idea that massive numbers of organizations all over the world were going to be adopting Vista in addition to the federal adopters really was the furthest thing from our mind. I mean, we sort of dreamed and hoped, but we didn't try to be coherent about it. So there are a bunch of non-federal adopters who got on early who have namespaces that they don't follow any schema. They're just randomly located. I think the Toppenberg Medical Group, for example, has like TMG or something. That's an example of the early ones. And it became clear to me about 20 years ago that was never going to fly, because we could see that Vista was more popular than we had imagined it was going to be for a variety of reasons, and that someday it could explode all over the world. Maybe it would even become someday the universal EHR that everybody would be running. And so if that was going to happen, we couldn't be one-offing these names. We really had to be able to distinguish adopter names from other kinds of namespaces, right? Pharmacy gets PS. Well, that means no adopter can have PS. So if you start scattering adopter names all over the place, what happens the next time you need to invent a new giant Vista application? What if it needs that namespace? There could be some nibble taken out of it by 2 or 3 adopters that just happen to have it. So I looked at the namespaces. I saw that J was largely free. I said, okay, J is going to be the namespace for non-federal adopters, generally speaking. If you're a non-federal adopter, your local namespace name is going to start with J. And I could see that we had a problem with individual Vista hard hats because they tended to outlast their association with any given organization. George Timpson worked for VA for a while, then he worked for DISTAR, then he worked for SAIC, which was supporting DoD, then he was working for MedSphere. And as he goes from place to place, does he have to rename all of his software? Now that he's working for SAIC, does he have to rename all his DISTAR software? At some point, there's going to be collisions, and you can't just grandfather in whatever it was called before. So it became clear that hard hats, first of all, often had more longevity than corporations, and sometimes even than government agencies. Certainly more longevity than their commitment to Vista, and that they needed continuity. So I set aside K. and every Vista hard hat who's stuck with Vista and did Vista development would be assigned one unique namespace under K that then they could take with them for the rest of their career. So if you are a hard hat and you have a workstation, it's logical that your code for naming that workstation would start with your namespace, your K namespace. Similarly, we could see international adopters. Mexico at one point we were real excited about before they got buried under a thing that many adopters get buried under, which is not thinking through the software lifecycle. Jordan adopted it, and they've been brilliant. So we had to come up with a schema that would allow us to set aside room so that if every nation on Earth someday wanted to adopt Vista, what would their namespace be? Where would they be writing software so that it would fit into this great dance? So we came up with U as the idea for the international adopters, and the next two letters are the same as the domain suffix, right? So Jordan is JO, so they get UJO. US is US, so they get UUS, and so forth. And then finally, of course, unknown adopters get ZZ, like they always, just like we did for software. So having named adopters, we're now in a position to name a site, right? So the VA used the A's to lay out all of the namespaces for all of their sites in a schema. So we've got APG for Phoenix, we've got ARJ for Puget Sound, and so forth. We've got a table of these. And likewise, Indian Health Service came up with a schema for all of their sites. So BZX, for example, is IHS Phoenix, and Tucson has its own, and so forth. Who knows what DoD did? Doesn't matter. So then within non-federal adopters, we had this problem. And this problem came up for the first time for us on the VAPALS ELCAP project. We'd never had it before, which is funny. It just hadn't occurred to us. It turned out we were ad hocing the way that we were naming our sites and our systems and so forth. We were focusing on naming them based on the project, and we hadn't thought through, do we need a universal site namespace for the Vista Expertise Network that we could use as a prefix for all of our systems that we create? And it became clear here that that was going to have to happen. And part of the reason that we started thinking through scenarios like this, okay, so what's the name for our environment where we're doing our development? Okay, in order to test that development, we need a system that's going to simulate what's running at Phoenix, VA. So we need to stand up one of those. And then at Phoenix, VA, when we stand up the VAPALS ELCAP server, it needs a name. And then if I'm going to simulate the installing on that server to talk to that system, then I need another environment that is simulating the environment that's going to be the VAPALS ELCAP server that's going to be talking to the Phoenix system. And so as we started thinking this through, we realized I really need to get crisp about naming these things. I mean, if it's actually at Phoenix, it should be under Phoenix's namespace of APG. But if it's over here simulating Phoenix, it should definitely not have the APG name, or I'm going to get confused when I'm talking. Am I talking about the one here that's simulating the one that's over there? Or am I talking about the one that's over there? I needed precision in the naming of these things. And so that's when I realized Vista Expertise Network needs to have its own top-level site code. And if I need it, probably World Vista needs it, and OSEHRA and all the other major software sources who work on dialects. They're all going to need a site code of their own. So that's when I came up with the developer development shop idea. So Medsphere, oh, I'm missing OSEHRA here. I'm sorry, I meant to put OSEHRA on this list. So VO is OSEHRA. So that means OSEHRA's sites, OSEHRA as a site would think of itself as JVO. And it could name its systems JVO something, something, something. Just like we could name our sites JVV something, something, something. And World Vista could name not the sites that World Vista supports out in the world, like Central Region or Jordan, but their own systems, like Nancy and George and others are maintaining, could be called JVW something, something, something. So I think somebody wants to be on mute, I think, at the moment. We're getting some throat clearing coming across. So likewise, for naming your individual workstation, if you're a hard hat, you name it after your own namespace. And if you've got multiple sites, then you can sub namespace. But if you don't, like me, I do everything in my power to avoid having multiple sites because I don't want to always be asking the question, is the file that I want on this particular computer? So I really only have one computer, and I back it up like crazy, and it's the only one I use. So I name it directly after my own namespace. So KBAF is the namespace for Han Balur. this laptop that you're looking at the image off of right now, that's plugged into the network here. But if you've got lots of computers, you can name them KBA, whatever your namespace is, and then append something to the end of it. The Kingdom of Jordan is UJO. So if they set up a server to support all their Ministry of Health hospitals, that could be UJO-MOH for Ministry of Health. And if they set up a different server that's for their military hospitals, maybe it's UJO-MIL. And if they've got university hospitals, maybe it's UJO-UNI. I mean, they can come up with whatever schema they want, but now they've got a way to name them. And the point is, because the system name is derived from the site name, which is derived from the adopter name, and because it's following namespace conventions, I could create two directories side by side for analysis, one of which had JVV SAMI on it, and one had APG SAMI, and I would know that I'm distinguishing Avicenna's contents from the VAPALS ELCAP server that runs at VA Phoenix's contents. The names are unique now. And they can all be combined side by side into directories under a common subdirectory, and there's no longer any confusion about which system we're talking about. So, and who decides what the system name is? The site does. The site decides. I don't decide. MDC doesn't decide. The Database Administration Committee doesn't decide. The whole schema of namespacing that the Database Administration Committee follows is the idea that they're the database administrators, and when they assign you a namespace, you become a database coordinator. You are now the coordinator for that namespace, and any subdivisions within it are your responsibility. And if you want to tell us about it, that's great, but no obligation. As long as you stay within that area and we stay within our area, we're not going to step on each other. And this is how the great dance works with all these thousands of developers and development authorities and so on all over the world. So now we finally come down to today's initial punchline, after which I'll break for questions for today. So the punchline is one of the things that we needed to name that's related to systems is there is a Mumps intrinsic special variable called $system. It's in the Mumps standard. And the point of $system is that it will be equal to a value that is absolutely unique in the entire universe of Mumps systems. No other Mumps system will have that same value. Effectively, it's a system ID. And the MDC is very clear about the syntax and also not very clear about the syntax in a way that is part of the fine art of establishing standards, which is to not say anything more than you have to. So what they say in the standard is it has at least 2 comma pieces. Right? You can see this value here, 47 comma blah blah blah, and what the standard says is the first comma piece is a number that uniquely identifies the Mumps implementer. So, for example, InterSystems has a number, and nobody else has that number. GTM has a different number, and nobody else has that number, and so on. So the implementers get their own number, and then after that comes a comma, and after that comes whatever the implementer wants to put there, so long as when you stick that on the end of their number, you end up with a unique value, right? They left it up to the implementers to figure out how they want to distinguish all. InterSystems has to figure out how they want to distinguish all the InterSystem systems. Maybe it's a license number that comes afterwards. Maybe there's a registry and people have to register or what have you. GTM and YadaDB came up with a clever alternative to the registries and so on and licenses that what we were expecting would follow that number. And what they came up with is they came up with a special value that you set in the Linux environment when you connect into the system, and that value is appended to their 47 comma. In other words, they're saying this is not our problem. It's an open source world. It's not practical for us releasing open source software to somehow try to force a registry. It doesn't make sense. So if you, Mumps, GTM user or YadaDB user, if you want to have a unique $system value, you have to figure out what comes after the 47 comma, and you set it into the environment variable, and as long as whatever you put there, GTM will append it to the end. So since our systems are GTM on Linux for VAPALS ELCAP, YadaDB on Linux actually, we had to be the ones to come up with the schema for what goes after the 47 comma. So this is what we've come up with. This is like several years of refinement have gone into this. So it starts with the value that's assigned by the MDC, the 47. Um, what comes next is a system name. It should be unique or unusual, and it's assigned by the site. But the real point is that it's pronounceable and user friendly. So when we've been talking for coming up on a year and a half now about the fact that our development server is called Avicenna, right? People have taken copies of our Docker images, and they all say they all know what they are. It's Avicenna, right? Avicenna is our development environment. For contrast, we have the Vista Expertise Network has a Taskman development server, what we call Andronicus, and that's where we do all our Taskman development and so forth. And these aren't guaranteed to be unique. I mean, these are, after all, named after real people, but they're not people that people talk about every single day. And they're all philosophers, which is our little schema at the Vista Expertise Network. And so if I talk about the Avicenna system and I'm talking to people in the Mumps community or the Vista community, there probably aren't a lot of systems called Avicenna. It is at least unusual. There was a time when I think it was Seattle VA, long, long ago, used to name their servers Huey, Dewey, and Louie, which on the one hand, you'd think, well, that's not very unique at all. But then you think, well, actually, not a lot of people are naming their systems after Donald Duck's three nephews. So maybe that is, it's at least unusual. And in our experience, most Vista system managers do something like that. So the point is you can use the system name as a shorthand to refer to the system, and frequently will. But you are also going to need a precise value, right? Following the schema I've just described up above, you need a short, precise, punchy code that is within, for example, the Vista community, guaranteed to be absolutely unique. So not like Avicenna, maybe somebody else has an Avicenna, but nobody else has a JVV SAMI. And the way we know is JVV belongs to the Vista Expertise Network, and we assign this name, and it's our system. Nobody else is allowed to create a system code that starts with JVV. And as long as we're smart about this and we never assign JVV SAMI to any other system, we've done it. We've come up with a code that's unique within the Vista community. And the way we did it is we stuck the namespace for our application, SAMI, right? That's VAPALS ELCAP. That's its formal namespace as a body of code. We stuck that. We had just appended it to the end because this is the development environment that is used to develop the SAMI application. So Vista Expertise Network SAMI application development environment, JVV SAMI. This approach to development environments was essential because what do we do when we're doing FileMan development? FileMan's default namespace is DI. So VA develops FileMan. George Timpson develops FileMan. I develop FileMan. There's a lot of FileMan developers out there. So you can't be naming these systems strictly after the application namespace itself. Same with Taskman. VA's got their own place where they're doing Taskman development, or they used to 10 years ago. I've got my place where I'm doing Taskman development. Somebody else might be. So if I name the server ZTM, it's not unique. It doesn't tell me for sure whose ZTM it is. And the reason that it matters is when there are multiple FileMan development environments, the odds that you're going to want to run and create an analysis system that puts them all side by side in the same directory structure is extremely high. So one of the biggest problems you're trying to solve when you're doing Vista development is how do I reunify the different dialect versions of FileMan? So it's not like, oh, it'll never come up that George's called his system DI and I called my system DI and VA's called their system DI. Of course it's going to come up. It's almost the surest thing to come up. So by him having his system be VSTDI and ours is JVVDI, and the VA's is maybe A6DI for the A6 namespace that the Oakland field office has, we're guaranteed that they're distinct. So that's the distinct code. But the problem is, it's not enough that it be distinct within the Vista community. The rules for $system are it has to be unique within the entire Mumps world. It's like, well, how do you coordinate that? That's like crazy. I mean, we don't even know all the Mumps software that's out. Some of it isn't even in medicine. Some of it's being used for shipping or banking or other things. We just don't know. So we have a Mumps DBA code, a database authority code, a database administration authority code. And effectively, it defines one group that is responsible for allocating all the alphabet of names within their community. And it also identifies a community intrinsically. It's the community that follows that database administration authority. So for example, IHS plus VA plus World Vista plus Jordan plus OSEHRA plus all of the Vista community together, whatever we call ourselves, we use the same database administration committee and we're following the same schema of names. But Epic's not. So Epic would have to be their own community with their own code and their own database authority and so forth. So, and likewise the banking, Fidelity's banking system. So we might say that, you know, the way we solve this problem is we say if you want to create a unique system under this schema, you come up with your user-friendly name for your community slash database administration authority, and you register it with the Mumps Development Committee, who makes sure that there's no duplicates. And that way there could be a Vista, there could be an Epic, there could be a Fidelity, whatever. And then within that, the rest of this name gets to be unique. Now I know that JVV Sammy is unique because I've appended Vista to the end of it, which establishes the community. And finally, there's one more little piece of information in here, and that is this value is also extremely useful. This dollar system value is extremely useful when you are doing performance monitoring, performance metrics. If you're baselining your system and you're running applications on it to see how fast they are, and you're storing microseconds of performance and, you know, number of global hits and number of locks that succeeded and failed and all that, that information, if on my Avicenna system, it only makes sense to compare the speeds of my application from one run to another if I haven't massively upgraded my system in the meantime. I mean, if I added 3 more computers and a whole bunch more RAM and I change my disk controller, I'm going to get entirely different performance data. So if I call this the same system, then I'm going to be inclined to compare apples and oranges, and I'll be confused about the fact that the numbers have all changed. So there's one last number on the end, which is a system version number. And basically, whenever you seriously upgrade that system, you should increment that number. It should always start as 1. So for almost all systems in the world, it'll be 1. But if you've done a massive hardware upgrade and it'll really impact the performance of software running on it, you should increment it to 2, and so forth. So now this number is not only useful for the other things that we've been talking about, it's also useful to combine it with performance measurement data so that you know what it is that you're measuring. And so this is the values that we've come up with. This is how we're naming our systems and our sites and our adopters. And so under the schema, we can then talk about the VA Phoenix VAPALS ELCAP server that we're going to be installing the software on. Is going to be, it's APG SAMI. And I gave it an informal name as well. We called it Akimel, named it after a Native American group that is local to the area around Phoenix. And Tucson, if we were ever installing at Tucson, there's a different group that's local, and that would be the informal name for their server, but the formal name would be based on Tucson's namespace. It'd be a something something SAMI that wasn't PG or RGA or whatever else. Every VA site could have their own something something SAMI that would be the namespace for the local VAPALS ELCAP server that they're running at their site, if they are. If they've got one. So now we've got a schema that allows us to name all these computers in ways that are absolutely unambiguous. And we can distinguish them from the Avicenna server where we're doing our development. And we can distinguish them from, if I stand up a simulation of the VA Phoenix VAPALS ELCAP server within Vista Expertise Network so that I can do testing, I would call that JVV APG, right? To simulating the Phoenix version of the software. So this schema is now extensible, and it should give us a way to name all the systems and all the sites and all the adopters in ways that are guaranteed to be unique. And that sets us up. That doesn't solve all the problems, but to go back to our initial patch stream architecture, that sets us up. That answers part of the question of it really helps us with the production repo classes, but it also gives us some information about what might be where I've got F and D and I and P as sort of stand-ins for the name of where this environment is running. It gives us some clue of the sort of thing we might put there to identify these servers that these environments are running on. Next week, we'll drill down to look at environments and how they're structured and how they're grouped together. And therefore, based on that, come up with a naming schema that allows us to set up multiple environments on the same system so that their names are distinguishable from each other, and so that they can be installed side by side and compared in a standardization environment. So before we break, I'm going to stop and say, any questions about what I presented this week? Comments, concerns?
Well, it looks like Sam had to leave already.
I think he did.
I think anybody else? Well, you all know where to reach us. So if you have questions afterwards, please feel free to email Rick or me or the question on the OSEHRA site.
Yeah, on the working group.
Yeah. Matt, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I'm good. Just thanks for the update, and everyone have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
Sounds good. Have a great day, guys, and we'll see you next week.